Hello, folks. In the past 72 hours, the Napoleonic Wars podcast has effectively imploded. For those of you listening on Apple Podcasts, my understanding is that you should be unaffected. However, the problem is that those of you listening on Apple may well be the only ones who can access the show anymore. In this grandiosely termed emergency bulletin, I want to explain what has happened, the implications for the podcast, where we go next, and most importantly, what you can do to help. It is not the exciting, delicious deep dive into Napoleonic nerdery that you all know and love, but this is about salvaging something from the ashes. So if you love the show, listening to this over the next 5 minutes and doing what you can to help has never been more important. So how did all of this come about? You will have noticed that from March this year, ads started appearing on the show as I switched from Spotify to Acast. In doing so, something went very wrong with the redirecting links and the analytics, to the point where the show, according to Acast, hemorrhaged downloads by a margin of 40%. Those figures were demonstrably untrue, though, because in the same period, we went from being a top 1.5% show to a top 1%. We simply couldn't have made that breakthrough if we were witnessing such a marked drop in support. With something clearly going wrong at the back end, I decided to sacrifice the ad revenue in order to restore and stabilize the connection with you, the fans. I therefore made the jump back to Spotify on the basis that I knew that platform enabled people to hear the show, and the download stats over there were more representative. Rather than reinstating the old links, however, the system has duplicated the show. There are now 2 iterations of this podcast, and neither of them works properly. One version, renamed the Napoleonic to make it easier to distinguish between the 2 feeds, in theory has all my old Spotify listeners plugged into it and has the 100 plus Spotify reviews plugged into its feed as well. But there's a problem. Well, 3 problems, in fact. For one thing, it's an old version of the show and hasn't updated since February 2024. For another, it might have the Spotify reviews, but it has none of the Apple Podcast reviews. However, by far the biggest problem is that despite the advice received from Spotify's technicians, none of my Spotify followers are plugged into it in practice. When I published an episode on that feed, I found that it received 30 downloads rather than the usual 900 in its first 24 hours. The Napoleonic is basically going out on a feed that amounts to it being a brand new show. Nobody gets an alert when a new episode drops, because despite the numbers and the reviews, it has no followers in practice. It's a return to the very first days of this show. No fan base and no reach. From a top 1% show, we just became a bottom 1% show. There is a second version, the true version as I tend to think of it. Titled the Napoleonic Wars podcast, this did update because it's the version that has been sent over from Acast. However, it has no Spotify followers. Most people can't even see the feed on Spotify, and the 100 plus reviews are all gone. There are pluses, as far as I can understand it. It is plugged into Apple Podcasts, so listeners on Apple Podcasts should be unaffected, and the reviews on Apple Podcasts remain. I'm also told it works on Spotify, although I've explained that actually there are problems there. At present, I think I have access to 49% of listeners, i.e. those on Apple Podcasts. But to be honest, this current situation is no more viable than starting from scratch. So if this cannot be saved, then there is a very real prospect that this is the end of the road. However, it was always my intention that if the show were to end, it would go out with a bang, not with a whimper like this. And you can rest assured that I will not go quietly into the night. We, yes, and I really do mean we, collectively, me, Luke, every one of my guests, every single follower, and every one of you listening now, we did not build the second biggest Napoleonic era podcast in the English-speaking world, with one of the biggest communities attached to any podcast out there, for it to be ripped apart because a leading podcast provider can't make the tech work. But if the podcast is going to rise again, I'm going to need your help. Which brings me to the point of this emergency bulletin. What can you do to help? I'm acutely aware that it is going to take years to rebuild. If Spotify's figures are to be believed, we had 3,300 followers on Spotify alone. And based on Spotify making up about a quarter of the market, the show should have more than 12,000 followers globally. With the current reach, I'm probably down to 6,000. Now, not all of those 12,000 listeners tuned in to every single show. Hell, the most popular show only ever made it to about 4,500 downloads. But 1,500 people have tuned in consistently week on week for well over a year. If you're hearing this and you enjoy the show and you want it to endure, please do these very simple things that will take a minute of your time to help with the recovery. Top of the list, check which version of this show you are listening to and following. Look at the show name on your podcasting app. If you're hearing this on the Napoleonic, you're listening to the wrong variant. Unfollow the Napoleonic, search for the Napoleonic Wars podcast, and follow that version. If you're already listening to the Napoleonic Wars podcast, then you're all set. Next, leave a review. I know it's tedious, it will take you seconds, but it will make a vast difference. And please do it whatever platform you're on, because I am trying to fight this on every front possible. If every single listener left a review, this show would catapult up the rankings regardless of this Spotify debacle. 1,500 reviews would change the game entirely, forcing the algorithm to rethink instead of putting us out to pasture. In practice, however, there is a 1% rule. 1% of people respond to any call to action. So if 15 of you leave a review, then sure, it doesn't repair the damage of losing 100 reviews, but it does at least get me part of the way there. And finally, spread the word. If you know a fan of the show or someone who would enjoy the show, copy the link to the Napoleonic Wars podcast and send it to them. Tell them about this problem and what I need people to do in order to reconnect with the show. Hit social media, whatever you're comfortable with. And if you need to, you can reach out to me on Twitter at NapWarsPod in order to ask any questions. This is your call to arms, my friends. The plea for the Napoleonic Avengers to assemble. Now, Napoleonicists, now is your time.